Okay, here we are for the third part of the video lecture for chapter 16. You recall in the second part and also first part, I guess, we talked mostly about community structure in terms of the interactions between organisms, food webs, food chains, all that sort of thing. In the last part, the third part of this chapter, we're going to focus on basically the physical structure of communities and how that affects the biological structure. Okay, so communities do have both a biological and a physical structure. The biological structure is, simply the species and various interactions between them that results from or can result from the physical structure. And so the question is then, or one of the primary questions in community ecology is then, what factors actually affect the physical structure? I mean, up to this point, we've been really focusing on the biological structure, and now, like I said, we're going to shift over to the physical structure and questions about what causes or influences physical structure are really important questions in community ecology. So, for example, how is the structure of a terrestrial community different from that of an aquatic or marine community? Okay. So we know that, and we talked earlier about this in the class, we know that we have both abiotic and biotic factors in any ecological setting, right? And the physical structure of a community is certainly influenced by abiotic factors, things like sunlight, temperature, especially in terrestrial environments. In aquatic or marine environments, the depth of the water, the current velocity or flow velocity, if there is flow or current, those are our typical abiotic factors. Also, dissolved oxygen concentration, pH, those are abiotic factors. Biotic factors very often include simply the spatial distribution of organisms, how large the organisms are, what is their density. Those are common biological or biotic factors to consider, okay, in terms of understanding, again, the physical structure of a community. Primarily when we're talking about terrestrial environments, it's the vegetation that for the most part defines the overall structure and form of the terrestrial community. And plants are the obvious thing that you see when you look at a forest from a distance, or you look at a grassland or whatever. And plants can vary in their growth form, obviously. Sometimes they're tall, sometimes they're very short. Seems obvious. They can be evergreen or deciduous. So we're talking about, pine trees, gymnosperms, for example, versus the broadleafed deciduous species that lose their leaves on an annual basis. They can be herbaceous or woody in terms of their tissue type. So we're talking trees versus, shrubs versus herbs, for example. Now, terrestrial communities, as I kind of suggested a minute ago, are often named and classified based on the dominant plant growth form that we see. So we have forests, for example. We have shrublands. We have grassland communities. But all of these are primarily named for the dominant type of plant assemblage or plant growth form that we see in them. That contributes obviously greatly to their physical structure. Okay, now every terrestrial community has a distinct vertical structure, what we refer to as stratification. Okay, stratification is the sort of vertical layering that's often very distinct and that we can see, especially in terrestrial ecosystems. All right, so plant growth form largely determines the structure, particularly in terrestrial systems. So the size of the plants, the branching pattern, if they have branches or not, the leaves, for example. Okay, so the vertical structure of the plants, in particular the canopy in a forest, for example, greatly influences and also is influenced by the vertical gradient of light. All right, so sunlight. Okay, so the canopy obviously is the uppermost layer in a typical forest community. It's the primary site of energy acquisition through photosynthesis. This is where most of your surface area for photosynthetic activity is actually found, right? So think about all the surface area of the leaves, for example, of the tree, the canopy of the trees. If the canopy is more open, so it's less dense, in other words, then more sunlight obviously is going to reach through or get through to the lower levels or lower layers of that stratified structure of that plant community to maybe what we call the understory. The understory is basically the smaller trees that we see. So in, for example, forests of the eastern U.S., which we're all relatively familiar with or should be, the understory has smaller trees, right? So different species than the trees that make up the formal canopy. But also we have young canopy trees as well that just aren't tall enough yet to really be considered part of the canopy layer, all right? Some of the smaller trees very often are things like dogwood, okay? But they do make up an important layer called the understory. Now, if the canopy is very dense and closed, then obviously there's going to be less sunlight sort of filtering through to that understory layer. And in that case, the understory and the shrub levels, which are sort of the base of the understory, will be more poorly developed than they might be if the canopy were more open. And again, this is due to a limitation of the amount of sunlight getting through. Then below the understory, we have what's called the herb layer, okay? And that's going to depend very heavily on nutrients, soil moisture, what kind of slope the plants are growing on. So, you know, is it a north-south exposure? Is it an east-west exposure? That kind of thing. How dense, obviously, is the canopy? And what is the understory density above the herb layer, right? Because the understory is also going to filter out some of the sunlight that would normally make it or might make it through to the herb layer. All right, then below the herb layer, we have the forest floor. And this is the layer where obviously the decomposition is taking place. So microbes in the soil and in the leaf litter layer are feeding on that decaying organic material and obviously recycling those minerals and nutrients back into the soil for subsequent plant or reuse by plants. All right. So if we take a look at an illustration from your textbook, we can sort of see this stratification I was talking about, or this zonation as is often called in a typical eastern deciduous forest. So we have our canopy here, right? This is where we have the oldest and most mature trees, obviously, filtering out a large amount of sunlight, okay? But then below that, we have a very distinct layer sort of separated from the canopy called the understory. Again, some of these species are the same species we see in the canopy. They're just immature forms. They haven't grown enough yet to be considered part of that canopy or to take part or play their role in that canopy. But then we also have different species as well that are species of trees that are just smaller as adults than the canopy trees are. Then we have our ground cover and, go back for a second. We have our herbaceous layer, ground cover, herbs and ferns and things like that. Sort of the shrubby layer that you might walk through and have to deal with, the thorns and thickets, that kind of thing in the forest. And then obviously the forest floor itself, where we have the leaf litter layer and the soil just below it, where all the decomposition is going on, the recycling of those minerals and nutrients and that sort of thing. All right. So that's a typical deciduous forest, and you could probably apply that to most deciduous forests around the world. Okay, now tropical forests will be a little bit different, but let's look at something that's quite a bit different now, which is a savanna or a grassland community, something like what you might find in Central and South Central Africa. So savanna communities have a lower species diversity or species richness, so they're going to have a more simple sort of overall physical structure compared to what we see here with a deciduous forest, okay, in maybe the eastern U.S. They'll have two distinct layers of vegetation. And the species that make up those layers of vegetation really depends largely on the amount of rainfall, heavily dependent on rainfall, especially in more arid places like Africa or South Central Africa. So we have woody plants as one distinct layer, and those are your trees and your shrubs primarily. And then we have an herbaceous layer of grasses. And that's what you see here. So right off the bat, you can see that's a much less complex structure, physical structure, than what we saw in the eastern deciduous forest of the previous slide. So we have our tree layer here, obviously our woody layer, and then the herbaceous layer, which is the what can be relatively tall grasses that make up most of the food for the large herbivore populations that these communities support, these plant communities support. All right, and of course, a soil layer, which is always going to be there, where the same things are going on as they would be in an eastern deciduous forest: decomposition and recycling of nutrients and minerals. Now, what about aquatic communities? They're also going to have a vertical structure, okay, but here the stratification or the zonation is largely determined by the physical characteristics of the water, or the water column. Okay, the water column is the depth of water from the surface of the water all the way down to the very bottom, which is called the benthic layer. And so if you think about like open bodies of water, like oceans and lakes, for example, we talked earlier in the class about how it is that they'll have a distinct temperature and oxygen profile. Okay, and so in lakes we talked about the epilimnion, the metalimnion, the hypolimnion, all that. We talked about how those can change seasonally, how you can get turnover of lakes, like we talked about before earlier in the semester. So we do have in most cases again a distinct stratification. But in aquatic systems, it's based more on the physical attributes of the environment rather than the biological attributes. So in a terrestrial community like the savanna we just saw, or the eastern deciduous forest, that vertical structure, that stratification is a result of the biological structure of the plant community. Whereas in an aquatic or marine system, that vertical stratification is more a result of the physical aspects of the environment, like dissolved oxygen concentration, the amount of light getting through, that sort of thing, temperature, for example. Okay. Then again, like I said, at the bottom of an aquatic or marine system, you'll have the benthic layer, that's the bottom layer of sediments, where again you'll have decomposition going on. You can think of the sediments at the bottom, or the benthic layer of the marine or freshwater systems, as sort of like the soil, if you will, of those systems. All right. Now, also in aquatic systems or marine systems, in terms of talking about light, we'll have stratification with regard to that physical parameter as well. So light will penetrate into the water to varying depths depending on how turbid the water is. Turbid means how many dissolved solids and things or suspended solids are up in the water column. Muddier water obviously lets light penetrate less deeply than clear water does, and that's what we're talking about here. So in terms of light penetration of the water, we'll have what's called the photic layer. All right, that's the layer where enough light is available to support photosynthesis, and that's the key determining factor there between what we consider to be the photic layer and the aphotic layer. It isn't necessarily how much light our eye can perceive. It's based on the amount of light available to actually support photosynthesis. Okay. In the photic layer, you have enough, although it might be at very low limits, especially toward the bottom of the photic layer. But then below that, where you don't have enough light to support photosynthesis, we have the aphotic layer. All right, aphotic layer. All right, and typically this is where you get down to about 1% or less light compared to what is coming in at the surface of that body of water. All right, so aphotic layer, there's just not enough light to really run photosynthesis anymore. Okay, so here we can see what I suspect it could be a lake or the ocean. But anyway, you see we have a distinct photic layer here where, at the bottom, you're probably down to about that 1% light level. Below that, you have the aphotic layer. And again, the depth of that depends on whether you're talking about a lake or the ocean, whatever. And then here you have the benthic layer, which is the sediment layer on the bottom. So the muck, basically at the bottom of a lake or a wetland or the ocean, for example, the sediment at the bottom of the ocean. All right, so we do have zonation here, although in many cases it's not as distinct, it's not as complex as what you might see in a terrestrial system, especially like a forest. Okay, so we have zonation or stratification due to biological structure of the community, but also due to the physical structure of the community, so terrestrial versus aquatic or marine, for example. And so if you have that sort of stratification present, you might suspect you would also see sort of stratification in terms of the composition of organisms that are found in each of those layers, and you certainly do. Now, we do generally see characteristic types of organisms or species living in each of these available vertical layers in a community. And it's true whether you're talking about an aquatic or marine system or a terrestrial system. Consumers and decomposers generally occupy nearly all levels of the community. They tend to be somewhat ubiquitous throughout all levels of a community, whether it's a marine system, aquatic, or terrestrial. Now, decomposers obviously are going to be more abundant on the forest floor or in the benthic layer because those are the primary sites of decomposition, but you can also see them up in the canopy layer, for example, of a forest, and to a certain extent up in the water column, in a lake. Now, we also do have interchange that can happen or take place among these vertical layers, but many mobile animals are found typically only in a few layers. And we're going to see that here in a little bit, especially with some marine species and some bird species, which are known for doing that sort of thing, kind of setting up shop in very certain or distinct layers within that stratified community. All right, so I mentioned birds. Birds are a great example of this. You're sitting on your deck looking out the woods behind your house, for example, and it may not be apparent to you that the birds, the different species, tend to be found at certain heights above the ground. One species may be very close to the ground, another species up toward the canopy, other species somewhat intermediate in terms of their altitude or height. This is also basically a form of resource partitioning, which, as we talked about, results from competition, so it's a result of natural selection. But birds within a forest community often occupy multiple layers, but are usually not found in all of the vertical layers. And so this figure from your book sort of shows that. This is the vertical distribution of species of birds in a forest community. This data was taken from Walker Branch Research Watershed in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where they've been doing long-term ecological research on that forested watershed. And what you're seeing here in terms of these bars are the sort of range where you find range in height above the ground surface where you tend to find the various species. So Carolina wren, usually found within 15 feet of the ground surface. The ovenbirds, a little bit higher than that, and you can see that as we go down the list of species, sometimes their ranges get really wide, but generally speaking, they go higher up toward the canopy. And so again, by doing this, by occupying certain levels within that stratified plant community, they can, to some extent, decrease competition and specialize on various food types and that sort of thing. And it allows for, this resource partitioning allows for a more diverse bird community. Okay, but you can see that, again, some species are sort of adapted to specialize on canopy resources, others, more mid-story or understory, some the herbaceous layer, and so on. All right, so species may also move among vertical layers on a daily or sometimes on a seasonal basis, okay? And this tendency of some species to move sort of up and down through that vertical stratification within the communities that they live usually reflects variation in the physical environment. So usually it's due to maybe light fluctuations over the course of the day, temperature fluctuations. It could be seasonal fluctuations in some food resource or the abundance of a food resource, for example. They could be changes in the required habitat of a given species at different stages of its life cycle. So there are a number of different reasons why species might migrate up and down through the vertical zonation or stratification of the communities that they live in the oceans and in lakes and also in rivers. There's a typical or sort of characteristic phenomenon, I guess I should say, among the crustacean invertebrates that make up the zooplankton. Zooplankton typically migrate vertically through the water column, and this is really well documented in large lakes, but also in the oceans. And this vertical movement of zooplankton is referred to as diel vertical migration, or just DVM for short, okay? Now, Typically, what's happening here is that the sort of submicroscopic or almost microscopic zooplankters like Cladocera, Daphnia, copepods, those kinds of things tend to move toward the surface of the water body, oceans and lakes in particular, when the sun goes down. As the sun comes up, they dive back down to deeper depths. And this has been heavily researched and studied, and generally speaking, it's been attributed to or as an anti-predation mechanism. So they're fed on by a lot of fish, for example, and fish are generally visual predators for the most part, especially when they're feeding on zooplankton. So it doesn't pay for the zooplankters to be up in the surface layers of the oceans or a lake, for example, during the day, because they're going to be much more visible. So during the day, they spend time deeper down, and then they migrate back up to those surface layers to feed for themselves at night when they're less likely to be fed upon by fish and that sort of thing. So this is well documented in a lot of crustaceans. There's a figure from your book, and this is it. And I don't know the details of these two species of decapod crustaceans in particular, but it looks to me like there's a typo in these figures. So notice the coding here. The green color is day and the blue color is night. And what they're saying here in these graphs is that for these two species, these guys migrate to deeper waters at night, right? Deeper waters at night, and come up to shallower waters during the day. Now that could be something that's sort of unique or characteristic of these species, but typically DVM works the other way around. And your book doesn't clarify this, so I'm not sure if this is something unique to these species or if this is an error in the textbook. But typically DVM works the other way around, where the zooplankters will move up to surface waters at night and dive back down to deeper waters during the day. Okay. All right. So let's talk about zonation a little bit. Excuse me. The biological and physical characteristics of a community, like I said, can change, right? We know that. If you've ever, driven from coastal areas of the eastern U.S. in toward the Appalachian Mountains, you've seen this if you've paid attention. In the coastal areas, you have, a lot of marshy habitats, lowland rivers, slow-moving rivers, that kind of thing. But as you get more, as you gain elevation and move towards the mountains, obviously things change more into deciduous forests and that sort of thing. So we can have zonation, like vertical zonation, what I call stratification, earlier as you move from the forest floor up into the canopy, or from the benthic area of a river or lake or an ocean up into the water column. But you can also have zonation as you move, across the landscape, not vertically, but horizontally across the landscape. Now, these changes that we see as we move across the landscape, in a lateral sense, they can be small, subtle changes, over short distances, but they can add up, and such that over very long distances, you can have quite pronounced changes in the communities that you're seeing. Now, think about, for example, the types of changes that you might see as you go from a valley up to a mountain, right? You're certainly going to see changes in the plant community, and if you pay attention, you're probably, as a result, going to see changes certainly in the animal community as well, right? Okay. Think about moving from the shore into the upland areas, like I said before. Again, you're going to see changes. So, zonation then, write that down. Zonation is the change in physical and biological structures of communities as seen when moving across the landscape. So not vertically, but laterally across the landscape. I have an example here to show you in a minute where they they looked at the plant community as they went from the from the base to the summit of the Siskiyou Mountains in the California-Oregon border. The dominant tree species certainly changed. There's, and that's what primarily we're going to see here in this figure I'm going to show you, is the change in tree species. As you go from low elevations up to high in the mountains, there's a decline in species richness, and you go from about, I think they said 17 to about 9 species from lower to mid-elevation areas. And at the highest elevations, there are only about 3 species of tree species. And also, because the plant community is changing dramatically, you'd expect that the small mammals, the birds, the insect communities are going to change as well. And so that's what you see here. So if we kind of zoom in on this table first, so you can see here we have our elevational changes. So we have 1370 to 680, right? We have a larger number of species, higher species richness. You go from 1680 to 1920, sort of a mid-level, fewer species present. I mean, these species here are not present at all. They can't tolerate the higher elevations, changes in, temperature, humidity, soil type, probably all kinds of things. And at the highest elevations, we have these three species. They are the only ones that are really tolerant of those more extreme conditions, okay? So we have distinct zones, and you can see this here. Here's our lower elevation zone, our mid elevation zone, and the highest elevation zone where we have the fewest numbers of tree species. Now, this figure isn't showing you data on the insect, bird, and small mammal communities, but you can expect that because there's such a dramatic change in plant community, you're also going to see a fairly dramatic change in the animal communities as well, because the plant communities generally dictate what the animal communities are going to be composed of in terms of species. This figure on the bottom shows you the rank abundance curves like we talked about before. And so here we have our lowest elevation zone. You can see it's much more even, so a lower slope, much more even slope with a larger number of species, right? Species rank here, it's about almost 30 species or so. The mid elevation, you have many fewer species, and note the very high slope. So that's telling you that it's not very even in terms of the distribution of those species at all. And then here we see the most extreme, the highest elevation, only a few species, 3, and very, very low evenness, okay? So dramatic changes in terms of zonation as we go from low elevation to high. All right, now what about coastal areas? So salt marshes, for example. If we look at salt marshes in northeastern US or northeastern North America, kind of like what we have around here if you go down to the coast around Wilmington, for example. As we move to the shore, or from the shore rather, to the marsh, to the upland areas, the biological and physical structure of the community changes dramatically. And you can see this over fairly short distances. And these changes, or these differences rather, are a result of environmental changes. For the most part, we're talking about changes in salinity, changes in water depth, changes in water temperature, and also microtopography, which is small-scale changes in the lay of the land, elevation, that sort of thing. All right, so these differences then lead to changes in the plants, as well as their density, their spatial distribution, that sort of thing. Dominant plants in the marshes tend to be grasses and sedges. There's a saying, sedges have edges. How do you know you have a sedge? If you look at the stem, it has edges. So it'll be shaped in cross-section like a triangle or something like that. And there are a number of very important sedge species in these salt marsh habitats. But these species do change from the tidal areas where you have the tidal action coming in and out to the meadow areas further up in elevation. All right, the dominant plants in the upland areas tend to be composed of shrubs and trees. And that's what you see here in this figure. So this is quite complex. You might not realize there's this much complexity in the community structure of a salt marsh and adjacent areas, but there is. So here we have our normal low tide lines. So that's where the tide is at low tide, right? And obviously at high tide it's going to come up. Here we have Spartina alterniflora. This is a very common salt marsh cordgrass, okay? You can see this down in the Wilmington area, Carolina Beach. It's all over the place down there. Beyond that, you'll have a pool and salt pan area. So as the tide goes out, you'll have depressions that are left as sort of puddles, and a lot of invertebrates and things will use those as refuge until the tide comes back in. Without those pools and things, those invertebrates wouldn't be able to survive there because of desiccation and the heat of the sun and that sort of thing. Then we have very often a tidal creek that'll separate the foreshore area from the hindshore area or rear shore areas. And tidal creeks are very often very salty. You can find a lot of crabs and things there that do very well there. Beyond that, you'll have salt marsh meadow or salt meadow right here, for example, with characteristic species of grass, a different species of Spartina in this case. Behind that, you'll have taller grasses like black grass. This is what's called the shrub zone, marsh elder, and then you start to get into that sort of scrub oak type of habitat. That's you can find, within, in some cases, just a few 100 meters or so of the actual low tide line. So a very complex community, but again, it's largely, going to be dictated by the structure, the physical structure, which is, the salt water coming in, going back out, temperature, sunlight, desiccation, soil nutrients, all kinds of things are causing this obvious zonation as we go from, higher elevations down toward the low tide line. It can be very complex communities. Okay, so when we look at the intertidal zone, let's say of a sandy beach, all right, we can break that down even further into distinct areas or zones. First, we have what's called the supratidal. So the supratidal zone is all the area on a beach above the high tide line. So this is area that's never going to be submerged underwater. Below that, we have the intertidal zone. This is going to be the area between the high and low tide lines. All right. This is where a lot of people sort of set up their beach gear and stuff when they go lay on the beach, right? Then you have below that the subtidal zone. So this is going to be the area below the tide line, always going to be submerged. All right. Now, what's considered true marine life begins in the intertidal zone. Okay, so nothing above the intertidal, so nothing in the supratidal, for example, is considered to be marine life. Everything below that is. So here, animals are going to be adapted to regular periods of submergence and exposure. An organism living in this intertidal zone is going to experience extremes of temperature, extremes of salt concentration, extremes of desiccation and inundation in a 12-hour period, for example. So these animals have to be very hardy. They have to be hardy. They have to be able to basically hunker down, for example, when the tide goes out, and maybe be able to live in the interstices, the spaces between the sand grains that are filled with water below the sand surface or the beach surface until the tide comes back in. So a lot of these species are burrowers, right? They are going to burrow down into that sand where they're protected from these fluctuations largely. And so you'll have an entire community of animals that just sort of appears under the water when the tide comes in that you didn't see when you were sitting there on the beach when the tide was out, but they're all buried maybe a foot or two below your beach chair. All right. Okay. And so species in the subtidal zone, which again is going to be always submerged, always below the low tide line, they can migrate into and out of the intertidal as the tides change. So you'll get fish that'll come up, for example, normally in the subtidal, but they'll come up into the intertidal when the tide line goes high enough. And so you get temporary assemblages of species in the intertidal that weren't there during low tide. So lots of fluctuation, lots of change. And here we can kind of see these sort of zonation areas, right? So we have our supratidal here, for example. Again, this area is never going to be submerged. You have characteristic species like ghost crabs, beach amphipods and things. Below that, we have the intertidal right here. So high tide line is there, low tide line there. Have a lot of bristleworms, lugworms, a lot of macroinvertebrates that might be buried, a foot or so below the sand surface. They are there. If you dig down, you can find them. Then below that, we have the subtidal, which is always submerged, characteristic species there, obviously. But obvious distinct zonation here as we go from lower elevations up to higher elevations, okay? But again, largely you see this community structure being dictated by the physical attributes of the environment, salinity, temperature, sunlight, all those things. Okay, so that is the end then of the video lecture part 3 for chapter 16. And we'll start off with our next chapter, which is going to be the last one here in just a little bit.